Hello everyone, welcome to Learn DAX channel. My name is Siddesh and in this video we are going to study the summarize and group by DAX functions. So essentially the work that's performed by both these functions is the same. The only difference that exists between summarize and group by is that in the group by function we have to explicitly give as input parameter the column that we want to summarize or the column that we want to group by. Whereas summarize is able to implicitly read what we are actually trying to summarize. Now, okay, all of this sounds very complicated. Let me simplify it with a very simple example. Let's say Virat Kohli scores 100, 50, and another 100 in three different matches. So if we ask the summarize function to group Virat Kohli's runs, it will be able to do it by itself. Like, okay, three matches, 100, 50, and 100. So it is able to do the calculation. Whereas if we are trying to achieve the same thing with the group by function, it is going to ask us, okay, how do I group by? Do I group by using the player ID or the match ID or something like that? Which means we have to explicitly give some input so that it can summarize the information. So that's the difference. Okay, enough of understanding the theory behind it. Let's get started with the example. So what we want to do here is the data that we have is we have five players having different player IDs, and then there are 10 matches that have been played. And each player has played certain matches. For example, the match one has been played by player one, again player one. So essentially, a match has been played by multiple players. And what we want to do is Virat Kohli has played three matches. I want to know how many runs he has scored. So I want to summarize the runs scored by Virat Kohli in these matches. I want to summarize the runs scored by Joe Root in these matches. And I want to summarize likewise for Jasprit Bumrah, Steve Smith, and Kane Williamson. Now, the reason why I've taken the example of cricket is because it's very relatable and we are able to understand it better. It's just something that I was able to learn quickly. So I hope you also understand the function in a better way. So let's start. We will create a new table for that because a measure doesn't work for a summarize function. Summarize creates multiple values and it cannot be converted into a scalar value. So that's the first rule. So let me just write here summarize. So I'll name this total runs scored summarize is equal to. Now, first of all, summarize. Okay. So what is the first argument? The first argument is the table name. So where are the runs? The runs are in the matches table. Okay, let me put matches as the first argument. Now, what is it that I want to summarize by? I want to summarize the number of runs scored. But what is the parameter that is repeating in the matches table? And it is the player ID. So I want to summarize by the player ID. So let me put that as the second argument, matches player ID. Now I want the runs scored column. Okay, so I'm going to do this. First, I'm going to name this column and then I'm going to give the expression. So I'll just write runs scored, or I'll just make it maybe total runs scored, and that will be sum x. I will have matches, and within matches runs scored. Okay, so now our table is ready. So let me pull out the values of this onto the canvas. Let me just change the setting to don't summarize and the total runs scored. Okay, so the player ID 1 has total runs 207, but it's not very understandable or readable. Like, what is player ID 1? What is player ID 2? Again, I have to go back to this table and then figure out, okay, who is player ID 1 and who is player ID 2. So I think there should be a better solution for this. We should have player name as well, right? So we are going to add the player name in this formula. So how to do that? So in this, before total runs scored, I am going to add something as player name. Now I want to iterate it row by row. So what if I just write player name? the IntelliSense is not working. I'm not able to get the player name. Why is it? This is because I am trying to fetch the player name as a single row. But in order to do that, I will have to use some aggregator function which is able to use a row context. That row context in turn helps Power BI to understand at what point which player I am selecting. So I will use max function and I will use player name. See, now the IntelliSense is working. Now if I close this and if I hit enter and if I drag the player name onto this column, see, I'm having the runs code. Let me just change this name so I can make more space. So I have Virat Kohli who has scored 207 runs, Joe Root who has scored 290 runs, and Jasprit Bumrah has 15 runs. Now let's verify this if the answers that we've got are actually correct. Let's check for Virat Kohli. I'll just filter this table where player ID is, let's say, 1. Okay, so clearly the value 207 is tallying with 207. Okay, so far so good. We are able to use the summarize function, and now let's start with the group by function. So let me create another table. Okay, let me name it total runs scored underscore group by is equal to, now again, group by. What table am I going to use? Matches. What is the criteria for grouping these values? It is the player ID. Now, I want the total runs scored. So I'm going to write total runs scored. Now, in case of the summarize function, I would simply write sumx and I would write matches. Then I would write matches runs scored, and that would be it. Summarize function is able to work according to this way, but this is where group by function differs. You cannot proceed in this way. If I hit enter, see, I'm getting some error. Function group by scalar expressions have to be aggregate functions over current group, which means I have to explicitly specify a current group. So how do we achieve that? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write sumx current group, and that group is going to be runs code. So now let me pull this onto the canvas. Okay, so this is tallying with the table that we created above. That match player ID 1 is 207, which is Virat Kohli. Player ID 2 is Joe Root, which has scored 290. Jasprit Bumrah, player ID 3 has scored 15, and Steve Smith has scored 200. So until now, everything looks good, and we have been able to understand the difference between summarize and group by. But some of you may want to know that, okay, I was able to get the player ID and the runs code, but how can I achieve the same functions like player name in the group by function? This is going to be slightly tricky, and I'm going to try my best to explain it in this video, but let's see how it goes. So let's say we want to add the player name. So I write player name. Now, in order to achieve a grouping, it needs a current group function. So if I write max x, this gives me two arguments. So I can write something called as current group. Now, this is done. Now I want to add a table, a column name, which is the player name. So if I write player name, okay, again, I'm not getting the IntelliSense. So what can be done? We can use something called as a related function in Power BI. And the moment I use the related function, I'm able to get this value. So let me just check for any other errors. Yeah, now it looks good. So now if I drag this onto this table, I'm able to get the player name as well as the runs code. This can be slightly tricky to understand if I go through this formula again. So the first argument is your table name. The second argument is the column by which you want to summarize or group by. Now the player name is slightly tricky in which you have to use the current group. But since we want to iterate it row by row in order to get one player name at a time, we use max x and we use the related function. If you want to fetch one column, values from one column at a time, we are going to use the related table on the one side of the relationship. So this is slightly tricky, but for this video, it's enough if we are able to understand that, okay, we are able to convert this, we are able to summarize the data for each player ID, how many runs were scored. And player name is just an additional functionality that we're trying to introduce in our output or the solution. So I hope you are able to take some value out of this video. I hope you are able to understand the difference between the group by and the summarize function. And if you enjoyed or if you learned something new from this video, please share it with your friends. And like I always say at the end of the video, happy learning.